Thanks for the introduction, Scott, and thanks for the invitation. Also, thanks for letting me play Leonard Skinner before I started. That would never happen in Germany, so I was telling the dean at Columbia the other day that you get to play a soundtrack before you start the lecture, and they were really blown away by that, so you're onto a good thing here. Bricolage is kind of an idea about how we've been working for the last few years. And I think there's an idea about how the practice is set up, which is maybe typical of our generation, but this idea of the academic aspect of it, of teaching, which both myself and Regina, my partner, do, and then the research aspect, which is part of the practice itself, as well as overlaps with the academic, and then the practice itself, which is a building practice and has been for the last 20 years. So, but this kind of way of bouncing between these kind of disciplines has been a really important way for us to, in a way, think the practice. Hal was the editor of this book that we just finished in the last few months, and for him, this idea of bricolage is an idea of Spielraum is the name of the book, which means kind of room for play. Is the way we think about in the practice this idea of experimentation, about a kind of open-endedness and approach to each project. So I was talking to Scott about that, this kind of the importance of being able to construct things, to experiment, to look at technology, emerging technology, old technology, and materials, and think about how we can use that in a way to drive an architectural project. So when we landed, we studied, at the GSD, and it was funny, I mean, like 20 years ago, Europe seemed to be a really promising place to go for a young practice. And when we got there, we started to look at things like technology. We started, as Scott was saying, we started to do factories. And as we were doing them, we would learn about the things they produced. And so this introduction to technology, to tools, made us really curious about how we could start to use these things for producing our own architecture. So maybe when we were students, we worked like this, in the late 80s when software was starting to emerge, you would use it to produce a kind of architectural form, and then later down the process think about how it might materialize and what kinds of tools would produce that. In the meantime, we might find ourselves, starting with materials and tools, and in a kind of process-driven approach, see what kinds of forms of spatialization they might produce. So there's this idea of, activity about going around and shopping around for different methods of doing things, and then with a kind of built-in curiosity where that might lead us to. At the same time, I think there's an idea of collaboration, of working with partners who have technologies which we can use, which we can appropriate. We started with Trumpf, and which then led to other companies that we work with who may or may not work with architects, but have a kind of interest in seeing their techniques have architectural applications. So that works, in all sorts of different places around the country, across Europe, where in a way we kind of collect these partners and then work with them, and then very much at the kind of beginning of a process up front, we'll go and do workshops with them and see how it might produce a project. At the same time, being in Europe, we have a lot of really good engineers in Germany and in the UK, and we'll work with the engineers also in a kind of upfront process in terms of starting a project and in a way thinking a project. So in some of these cases, sustainability engineering or structural engineering often have really a key kind of status in how a project is thought about, how it's conceived. At the same time, we use institutional partners as a kind of place between, say, starting a project and thinking and actually doing a building. So often we'll use exhibitions as a way of testing ideas or projects. See, these are a couple of examples. We'll be doing a summer house for the Serpentine Gallery in London in the summer. But these are, and many exhibitions at Venice, but really for us interesting ways of testing some of these ideas. And another thing we did in the last few years is start to produce these kinds of atlases, and you can also do this as students. They're very quick, they're very cheap, but we like the idea of the atlas almost like constructing your own building catalogs. So we did this with the Architectural Association in London, so we could do these very quickly, very cheaply. And the focus was not so much on any building that we did, but really about processes of construction and the idea of verbs about doing something. So if it's stacking or folding or cutting, how that might produce a kind of project. So we started producing these almost like, like a manual or something. And at the same time, these manuals were complemented by exhibitions where we would exhibit, some of these work pieces, almost like a natural science exhibition where these are models, or often working the scale of 1:1, but kind of work pieces where they did have a kind of, almost like an encyclopedia or an archive, but in a way for ourselves, for our practice. So you could activate these things, you could use them on a project or not. But this became kind of an interesting way of working in terms of gathering these things. At the same time, there was this kind of funny relationship of learning from industry, but at the same time, we were building for industry. So we're building lots of factories, particularly in southern Germany and Switzerland, which to us, seemed kind of like a neglected building typology. We knew about say Albert Kahn's factories in the 20s for Ford in Detroit, or Nervi in northern Italy, but it was a kind of an interesting project in terms of the workplace, how people work in factories, what do they produce, how do they communicate with each other, and at the same time, we could test these ideas about materials and production, say in this case prefabricated concrete, and how you could use that to make a large building. And factories are kind of interesting because they're never finished. You're constantly adding onto them. So it was a really kind of an interesting building typology, both in terms of its content, what they were building in these spaces, but also as a kind of architectural project in themselves. So what we would do as we started to discover some of these techniques or technologies was to use students, and we have students in our office as interns, and we almost run it like a studio. So students would fly from Berlin down to Stuttgart and then look at a machine and start testing the capacities for a machine. This is laser cutting. How fast can you cut something? How intricate? What would be the economics of producing something like that? And then to think about architectural applications. So this was an installation at the Swiss Architecture Museum in Basel, where we took the tubes and started to rotate them, which could then be an idea for an application for a facade. A lot of focus on facade making in the last few years also. So whereby, kinetically rotating the tubes, the project has obviously a kind of aesthetic capacity like a moire. At the same time, it has a performative capacity as sun protection, produces kind of transparency or opacity for this showroom in Sweden. But that's like a really compressed path in terms of starting in a really almost a naive way about how to use a tool and material, but then to look quickly how we might be able to exploit that and use it in a building. Some of the things we do is to revisit historical projects. So in a way, space frames were historical for us. If you thought about Buckminster Fuller or I.M. Pei in the 60s and 70s, and then we would think, well, how could you kind of rethink that project digitally or even parametrically in different materials from steel to concrete, so that as we're doing competitions, in the European scene, we try to embed research projects within that. So this was for a museum in Zurich that we designed a kind of structure for both the facades and the roof. So in this case, the space frame makes the facade for the building. At the same time, there was a kind of climactic idea for it, the space here would be a different temperature and humidity than the gallery spaces over here. So that doing these competitions, win, lose, or draw, there was still some kind of value in these projects for us in terms of studying them. As it was kind of hinting at, I mean, we like really big models and working one-to-one, but also going back and looking at historical models, such as Konrad Wachsmann's hangars that he was working on 40s, 50s, and 60s as a kind of idea for a kind of mega structure or superstructure. So that might be a reference in a project like this. This was a competition for an exhibition hall for steel. They make these really nice chainsaws in southern Germany. And it was also a kind of attitude about technology. I mean, if we need high tech, we use high tech. If we want to use low tech, then we'll use low tech. So the idea for their project was to use their chainsaws. They had a forest where they could, in a way, harvest pine trees from their forest, and then our idea was to very simply use the trees, just strip the bark off of them to make a kind of space frame out of logs. So I mean, for me, coming from Montana, it was a very obvious way to work. But to make a showroom for them next to their old 50s office building, which we also reclad with a new facade idea, but to really use the tool in a completely direct way to construct an architecture for them. So in a way, like Wachsmann's plans, the floor plate could be extremely flexible. They could have exhibitions, they could have events there, and then be covered by this long span timber structure that we could also build really cheap, and we could build it really quickly in the time frame, and then have this kind of activity here in terms of testing and showing chainsaws in that space. That's what they do. They can juggle them and everything. So in a way, that for us was a very obvious kind of path in terms of really looking at what they did and then coming up with an architecture that would fit for that. And these are these Mittelstand companies, which means they're family-owned companies where the architecture is really important in terms of representing their ideas. So another thing that we did, at some point, exhibitions, for architects, I guess, we don't show models and drawings so much anymore, but really use exhibitions to create a kind of architecture at the scale of a gallery. So the light structure project was one where we used scripting to laser cut plexiglass. So each cut would produce two pieces, which would be tangent to each other. And then to construct a kind of environment in the gallery through these pieces that were then animated by light. So as you know, light travels through plexiglass, and then the actual edge of the cut would be where the light would come through the space. With this other idea of sort of tube cutting, another one was you could scroll cut tubes that would then start to produce a radius, like a catenary arch, and then to look for applications for it. So in a way, and I was talking to Scott about this earlier, but this is kind of a typical project in the office where we got a bunch of students from GSD and Penn, and just we were asked to do a pavilion for the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt. So the students just made millions of ideas about if you had a machine that could make a radially complex arch, what kind of forms could you make? So again, the invention of a digitally defined radius arch produced all of these different kinds of models. Then we selected one that we liked, and then then at some point went to the structural, again at the beginning really with the structural engineer looking at a way how to produce this, how to produce it with a skin also. So what we did is we went to the museum, we mocked this up at a scale of 1:1. We had a little clip that fastened it onto the steel. Each piece could be unique, and then found a way to easily attach plexiglass shingles to it. So you just put a kind of piece of Velcro behind it, and you can just stick stick it on to these little holders here, so we could skin the whole thing, within a couple of hours, and the rain would go over it. You could put photovoltaic cells on it if you wanted to. So that was kind of process of, again, a kind of discovery of a machine that would make those pieces, and then looking at the kind of spatial and formal models that would make. Thicket is a project, kind of a work in progress we've been working on for the last year. This is the first iteration of it in an exhibition we did in Berlin. And the idea of it was a kind of vertical space frame where we took 2mm stainless steel rods and then started bundling them together. We tried to weld them, but it took forever. It was almost impossible. So we just ended up taking zip clips, like for a garbage sack, and clipped the whole things together. But it became an interesting project in the sense of a kind of vertical structure that was almost dematerialized because it was so fine, and the reflectivity of it. We taught ourselves how to build these things in a kind of mass production mode where you could fasten and put these things together. But the idea of a kind of structural array, and then discovered we could attach a roof to it and a floor to it, but almost like an idea, I suppose, of a labyrinth. So from the component, the bundles, we could produce like almost like a domino type structure with a very lightweight plywood roof and a plywood floor to produce that piece. So and what we did is we built it. This is our studio, so we just built it in our studios at a scale to 1:1, which, I mean, I saw a lot of that today with your work. I mean, because you have so much space here, you can build this way, which we could test the scale of it. We could, we put a bunch of sandbags on top of it to see how much weight you could put on it before it crushed, how it worked in terms of light, how it worked spatially, how it worked for lunch breaks, you name it, whatever. So then the sort of next step in this project, which is what we're working on right now, was to look at the project at a much larger array. So if that was like the 1:1 piece that we produced, we looked at it, in this case, literally like a domino system where you could keep adding to the project to produce almost like a mat scheme, or, like at the scale of maybe like a small village or something like that, and what that scale would be, and what kinds of arrays we could produce with the idea. So as a work in progress, now we're sort of shopping around for a venue or a place where we could construct this, where we would have more space to do it. But again, for us, it's a kind of experimental architecture that is somehow parallel to the other projects we're doing in the office, but at the same time has kind of impact on the way we think about our other projects. This idea of collaboration is one that kind of jumps over disciplines. A few years ago, we had won a competition for a design house in Munich for BMW, and the head of design at the time was Chris Bangle, American from Wisconsin, and he had invented this really strange car, which was called Gina, and rather than metal car skin for Gina, it had an elastic fabric for it. So Chris's idea was you could, in a way, configure the car you wanted to in terms of the components of the car, but also, in a way, the shape of the car. So we thought it was a cool idea for a car, but I mean, even more so for architecture. So we ran this as a studio at the GSD for lightweight housing. So in a way, it was kinetic. So you could have a house that got bigger or smaller. You could add to it. It didn't cost very much. It was lightweight and ran that way. And somewhere in between, we tested this idea as a kinetic wall. So the format was for Rem Koolhaas's Elements of Architecture Biennale last year. So we built the kinetic wall in the context of his walls show. So in a way, you have an archive of walls, from extremely archaic ones, a stone wall, brick walls, to kind of things affected by modernism, acoustical partition wall, a very banal glass partition wall, and then maybe a little tongue-in-cheek looking at a kinetic wall, as something that might happen, in the near future. So, I mean, we did this ridiculous model and then showed it to Rem, and he loved it. And but it really wasn't so much about making a wall, but the idea of the kinetic aspect is something that would change the section. How that changes the space between our wall and another wall. So, and this was something that really came out of Chris's research for a car idea, but the idea was that it would have a front to it that you would experience as a surface as you walked along it, and behind it is kind of the nuts and bolts. It's the machines that push the skin, a timber space frame that holds everything together. But in a way, for us, maybe it's a different way of thinking about a building block that you could add 2 or 3 or 4 of these. You could make a roof out of this. And that also overlapped with our studio ideas for the GSD in terms of a new kind of housing. So it had it was a surface, it was translucent, it was made out of rayon, it was pretty cheap. It wasn't easy to put it together, but as a kind of, again, work in progress, or thinking about an architecture that we haven't quite sorted out, but using these exhibitions to get to that point. So in the meantime, I mean, we are doing building projects that, again, are informed by that research aspect of the practice. So, I mean, probably a good example we did a few years ago was in Korea, which is the so-called True Tech building. We'd never built in Asia. We had no idea of what context might mean there. And it was basically this kind of instant city master plan where they were really building buildings left to right. And it's kind of core and shell building, so it wasn't about detailing every single aspect of the building, but coming up with the idea of it. And it was about the time of the practice also that this idea of facade making, or a facade as a kind of architectural site in its own right, was a way of thinking and working. So in this case, the idea was to use reflective glass as a kaleidoscope, as a way of assimilating the building into a kind of emerging or unknown context that have a visual effect. So no matter what's happening, cars driving by or the weather changing, the facade would respond to it. So when we were students in Cambridge, we really liked, a building like Harry Cobb's Hancock building, which, famously had this reflective glass skin in the 70s, and, it would have kind of, a relationship to the historical buildings around it. At the same time, what really fascinated us about it is, it was never perfectly flat. There was always this little bit of distortion in that surface, that this kind of strange kind of ability to camouflage itself into this context. So, but rather than a deficit, we saw that as a kind of positive thing. So what we did is we started to make 1 to 2 mock-ups in our courtyard. So this is our offices behind. And realized in a really, really flat surface, you could get an amazing amount of kind of visual distortion. Again, like a kaleidoscope. So the idea was to take, again, had underground parking here, offset core, almost like a veil to wrap this core and shell building with this skin that would have this ability to kind of mediate between, fairly private interior program and an extremely public exterior as a kind of work-live place. So in this slide, you kind of see these lots being prepared for the next phase of construction, but it sort of didn't matter what the neighbors would be contextually, the building would somehow respond to that. So, and a lot of it was the geometrics of working it out, figuring out, how big of a piece of glass we could use, finding a fabricator in Korea, bringing the glass from the States, from Minneapolis, working with a grid, adding this idea of diagonals, combining a 3-dimensional crystal-shaped facade piece with a 2-dimensional one, taking one type, then flipping it upside down. So you get an incredible amount of complexity with, at the end of the day, really just 2 kind of basic types. And then, kind of special indentation here where the entrance is, showrooms down here. But, and it was also about kind of shifting to a different building culture. In like Germany, you could do this, but, but it would be so expensive, they wouldn't want to do it, and it wouldn't meet the building code or anything. So just by shifting, to a different place, we could do a completely different kind of skin and surface solution for a project like this. To explain the geometry to ourselves, we started building large-scale wooden models to kind of figure out how everything could connect. And again, this fairly flat building section, we combined CNC technology with just off-the-shelf aluminum window extrusions, and then just by cutting them, we could generate this kind of geometry for this building. To do this, we brought Arups in from Hong Kong. They did workshops with the Korean fabricators. So it was really super exciting for us to just kind of drop in a way from Mars to Seoul, Korea, and work with local fabricators with some European expertise to produce a facade system that for us, for anybody really was completely unique, and do it on time and in budget and all this stuff and test it, do a mock-up and blast it, with wind and water, like typhoon strength, I guess, to get it to work, and then get permission to go into kind of very quick production runs of staging these pieces and then bringing them on site. So again, it sort of dawned on us, that we were really beyond the kind of building catalog tradition and could actually start to construct buildings for ourselves in a really unique way, and not in our backyard, and to go places that were for us quite exotic, and be able to operate both as a kind of urban object, but also in these kind of interior lofts to produce kind of a new idea about what office space could be like and how it could be experienced. And then, in a facade that could change, it could become highly reflective, it could be transparent at night, and it could be affected. It could also be stolen by Chanel. And we threatened to sue them. All we wanted was the shoes. And we threatened to sue them, and then they threatened to sue us, and we said, well, you have kind of a chronological problem. We actually did the building before you did the spring collection, so we'll talk about patents later. But this is the building. Again, as a film, again, it would respond to cars, people walking by, changes in the weather, insane window washers, LED advertising, but so really, it really wasn't about the building being about, a fetish about detail making, but it was really about a kind of surface that could, be animated by, just an environment that's constantly, for us, was unpredictable and changing in that kind of context, and as a curtain wall that could wrap and continue a roof garden in these kinds of details. So. As well as huge windows that could open almost like barn doors, or an entrance here, and then kind of trickling in terms of detail, the facades, the suspended stair on the interior, and then a timber version of the facade as a lobby wall in the interior. So let me just click. At the same time, sort of jumping back to Germany. This is kind of a typical situation where we've been working with this company, for the last 15 years, both renovating buildings, adding buildings along the Autobahn here, where, in a way, this idea of the green factory, where you could add to this building, well, at least until you crash into Thales here, the neighbor here, but in a way, buildings that can be added to versus other buildings which we were doing, which were more one-off, like solitary buildings, like this cantina building here. But in a way, this place has really been, like a laboratory for us in terms of doing different kinds of buildings, different typologies, different kinds of technical solutions. Really like a large campus where we could work. But one of the buildings we wanted to do for Trump was to use their technology in an even more direct way, to use the laser cutting to produce a gatehouse to this campus. Historically, we were thinking of, like French architects like Jean Prouvé from the 50s, who was working in metal, sheet metal, and we're thinking, well, if he had the technology, what would he do today? So the gatehouse is this gigantic cantilever project. We work with structural engineer Werner Sobeck. It sits on these 4 columns here in compression and tension. There's a gigantic, counterweight in the ground so it doesn't tip over. But going into that project, we discovered, that Trump was making things like this, which was scalable. It could be like the deck for a ship, or it could be a tabletop, and they were laser cutting this and welding it, and it's extremely light very quickly. And so the question was, could you take this and think about it at the scale of a building? So as a point of departure, something they would be familiar with. So in section, you see the cantilever of the building. This is kind of the giant counterweight over here. And then to create a facade for it that'd be entirely made out of glass, just completely a glass curtain wall. So what we did was we started inheriting these loading diagrams from Werner's office, and we were always really fascinated by these drawings, but maybe, like in a more literal way, like how could the building visually, very sort of directly represent the kind of logic of, loading, like compression, tension. So what we started to do was laser cut 1 to 50 models that took on that idea of lightness at the end of the cantilever and a kind of more compactness at the loading points from the loading drawings that we inherit. At the same time, other layers within the project, in this case, the thickness of the wall became a giant light source. We could put lighting within the depth of that structure. So as a gateway, it could show exactly how it was constructed, but worked as a kind of, almost like a giant lantern. So like some of these other projects, we built a one-to-one to understand how to fasten it, integrate the gutter into the project, built all these things off-site, and then brought them on-site, and then just lifted the whole roof in one piece and then dropped it on the 4 columns. And a lot of that was kind of translating this sort of apparent simplicity of the piece that they had before, the laser cut piece, into something that needs expansion joints and all the complexities of making it into the building. It had a kind of reverse camber, so we put these sandbags onto the roof to kind of weight it so it would line up into a single line. Historically, we were interested in translating the idea of that's how they make fences in Germany. They have a lot of time. So these kind of logs between pickets, our idea was to translate that into these cut plexiglass tubes, which vary in side, which then we could sandwich in between 2 layers of glass to produce these curtain walls. So it had kind of ornamental effect. At the same time, it had a performant effect in terms of being the sun shading for the spaces in here. And then, like I said, it was entirely made of glass. So even the posts are made of laminated acrylic. So in the daytime or at nighttime, the entire facade is, in a way, completely translucent or transparent. So in order to do this, we had to invent a detail for it. So you have this kind of double facade here with sun protection, all that stuff, which is, of course, very fragile. So if it snows like 2 meters on the end of the cantilever roof, it won't crush the facade. So we built this kind of accordion gasket. So those 2 things could move independent from each other. So, but there was, this kind of pleasure of kind of going through a project where with the engineers, you can invent the kind of material idea, structural idea of the project, but all the kind of technical resolutions, details that make the building work and make sense. At the same time, with Werner also, we did the campus restaurant for the company, and these cantinas, in these German companies, is usually a really horrible cafeteria in the basement of a factory where they have really terrible German food. And here the idea was to transform the cafeteria in a way to an event space. So they use it for that, for meeting, for communicating, for events, for music, for speeches, for Christmas parties, whatever. And the idea then was to, and this idea of a kind of infrastructural idea was to look at cell structures and hierarchies of cell structures and how that might make a wide span structure. So with our students, right off the bat, we were looking at, like a timber way and, like steel structure, concrete structures, and then started to look at a hybrid structure of timber and steel, and then started to think about the roof as a kind of filter for daylighting the space. And then at the same time started working with our fabricators, and these guys are Hosfeld Alman, and they're down in the Black Forest, and they're these amazing kind of timber fabricators. So they were very keen on this project and working with us. So within weeks we could go down there and start doing mock-ups with them. So so this little soundbite is really the idea of teaming up with those guys and figuring out, where you could CNC cut a honeycomb structure in a really, really complex way, and then combining it with steel, which is, super strong, to get these wide spans. So these images are really about the production runs down in the Black Forest. So they were doing this run for us, and the other bay, they were running Shigeru Ban's Pompidou project. This is Gunter. He's like taking all our drawings on board and redrawing the thing. Started building a mock-up, looking for places, to make it, dumb down details if they're too complex, make them simpler, and then ended up building the mock-up into the building. Which means we could build things really fast and pretty economically. So these are the pieces coming from the factory on site, and then we would use these little helper columns to put it up quite quickly. So the idea of the building is to make a pavilion in this campus, but not so much as an object, but as a roof, almost like a leaf over an excavation. So the whole campus is connected at a tunnel level. So in cold weather, everybody can, be connected. And to use the roof to enclose a double height space here, which you enter at a kind of -4 meter level, and then have a mezzanine over it. So this is the Autobahn over here. Again, the idea of the landscape is that it comes under the building and then out, and then the roof floats over that space, and then the roof has a kind of structural depth to it that allows us to condition the light that comes through it. So again, once we had the steel up, we could construct this quite quickly. You could sort of target different structural pieces for it, and then which I'll show in a second, but this idea of an open plan that could change, and then by putting the building slightly underground, we generated this mezzanine level here. There's only one core in the building. We use these column groups of 2 or 3 columns to kind of stiffen the roof laterally so it wouldn't tip over. And then all of the cells could have a kind of status, so they could be skylights, or they could be artificial lighting, or acoustical cells within this whole kind of matrix of the structure. So in a way, the ceiling of the space is extremely articulate, very specific in terms of what those each one of those cells is. At the same time, the plan is almost a kind of open plan where you could use it for a cafeteria or for event space. But it was also the first building really where we designed all the pieces of the precast concrete stairs. We designed a tile for it, the furniture. I mean, we came up with a new facade idea for the project, which had these 2 different kinds of spaces, a kind of double height space, and then a kind of overflow space in this mezzanine, which is much lower within that. So again, jumping around, activating different fabricators. I mean, there's a real long tradition in this country for terracotta ceramic buildings, particularly turn of the century, the last century. You can find ceramic people who will make a custom tile for you that are not so expensive, both as a kind of exterior cladding and in this case also for an interior one. So again, we could kind of shop around, find fabricators to make, in the case of this building, all of the components for it. Again, the idea of, unlike the factory buildings, which we're always adding on to as a kind of social center for this campus where everybody could meet. You know, the blue collar guys, workers, and the white collar workers can all come here and sort of overlap. So in the meantime, we were doing factories for years and years, and then in the last few years, we started working in Berlin, which is maybe typical of working and living in the town you are. You usually don't do that much work there. And with the change of the city planning director, we found ourselves doing more and more projects in Berlin. So this was one of the first ones we did, the Tour Total, which is an office building for a French energy company near the train station. And it was in the context of a whole new master plan here to the south, or the north, sorry, of the train station here. So the building was getting a lot of attention from the press, and politically it was important, you know, that the city was not just doing these very cheap hotels around the train station, but an architecture of a higher quality. So maybe like the Korean project, it's also a core and shell building. We knew the sort of focus on the facade would be extremely important. So in a way, we looked at historical facades in Berlin, and you have to remember Berlin, you know, unlike New York or Chicago, it has no real strong tradition of high-rise making. So in a way, if you thought of something like the Chicago frame as a load-bearing facade was a kind of way to start and think about it. At the same time, we didn't want to do it in you know, a literal historical way, but we're interested in the kind of precast concrete being differentiated within this skin. So in the skin, you know, is the windows from a sustainability point of view. It made sense. You could have operable windows. You could generate opaque surfaces that you can insulate better. You could hide the sun screens on the exterior in that facade, and then to detach the building as a tower from the lower buildings, which is kind of the typical Berlin typology of tower and a 22-meter high base, and then create this pedestrian passage. So it was a way of, I guess, looking at a master plan not being set in stone, but something that could adapt, you know, to the specifics of this building and the client. So, like I said, it's a load-bearing facade with a relatively column-free interior, where, you know, all the kind of, you know, performance stuff happens within that facade depth. Because of our, you know-how with fabrication, we could produce the formwork for the concrete outside of Frankfurt, which are very precise. But then, you know, a kind of funny other thing happened with precast, where, you know, historically you do something in precast and then you just repeat it 1,000 times. We discovered we could make 150 unique pieces that were extremely precise, that had a really beautiful finish as a kind of exoskeleton structure in this process. In making the facade as a kind of load-bearing facade, we had a kind of two-story T component which offset and kind of stitched together structurally, and then combined it with, you know, almost kind of an origami K cut section that produced this kind of visual dynamic in the facade, so that again it was somehow familiar as a historical type, the kind of Chicago frame, I guess we'd call it, but at the same time has this kind of visual dynamic of you know, having the facade work on a kind of visual dynamic or diagonal around the building. And also, you know, maybe, you know, unlike, say, World Trade Center, the buildings there, you know, instead of having this flat glass facade, this kind of depth in the facade, again, where the sun protection is, but for us, it's also a spatial depth, both as an exterior, as a public facade, but also as an interior that you experience. Like some of these other projects, we went around and we designed a tile for the interior of the building. Oops, on back there. My brain's not speeding up. Yeah, the interior with the ceramics here and the stair details, and then have completed last week a second building with a metal curtain wall that now defines that pedestrian passage between the two buildings. But in a way, we'll be doing 4 buildings at the train station, and each one is a kind of variation on itself. So each one will have a slightly different idea about the facade and how it gets executed in this assemblage of urban buildings. So for this was kind of an interesting shift from industrial projects to much more urban ones. Another project which is very much a kind of work in progress is the Smart Materials House for Hamburg. And this project, which we started about 5 years ago, was a call for affordable housing in Hamburg, outside of Hamburg proper, and it was a competition. It was called so-called Smart Materials House, which at the time didn't mean anything to us. I mean, any kind of material can be used in a smart way or a stupid way, but but we started using that as a premise for setting up the project, and for housing, and the idea was to create a kind of precast element out of an infralight concrete and combine it with timber. So it was important that it would be flexible space, it would be domestic space, and that it had a kind of exterior to it through these balconies. So, I mean, the first thing we did, again, working with our engineers, Schleich and Transolar, is we went shopping, through all the kinds of, materials that were out on the market that were allegedly smart, from polycarbonates, and through a lot of the experience with Mike, we started looking at infralight concrete. Infralight concrete it's a self-insulated concrete. The aggregate is clay or recycled glass. So in a way, it's like one-stop shopping. If you have a piece of this material, you don't need anything else. It's the fireproofing, it's the structure. It's the insulation, and then the idea of combining that with timber, which seems unorthodox. So that's the concrete when you cut through it, and that's the gulaminate timber. That's a picture after our Christmas party. But you could take that material, right, the glass, and then you could use that when it was recycled as the aggregate for this material. And the material, if you take that material and you put it in a bathtub, it'll float. At the same time, structurally, it was really, really light. So again, historically, we were interested in this idea of prefabrication. This is Nita Khrushchev, looking at a model of a Plattenbau. Plattenbau were these plate buildings in the 50s and 60s of social housing in Eastern Europe. With a limited number of components, you could produce these things, and there's miles and miles of these things all over Europe. At the same time, in the Plattenbau, there was a kind of arts program where there were ornamental systems embedded within the kind of repetitive systems. But so in a way, we were really keen on kind of revisiting this as a kind of production idea, but also some of the geometrical and ornamental systems within that. Then all of a sudden, we realized with this material, it's like the thicker it is, the better it is. So it was like the opposite of buildings from the 60s, the glass and steel that want to be extremely thin. In this case, it was like returning to guess what we used to call poché, that kind of plan thickness, which is a spatial one, right, and a very figural one. That was kind of made logic to our project, or looking at other historical projects like Mongeretti's vases. This kind of beautiful idea, really, of a kind of figural plan that could have a kind of material substance to itself, but make space in a very different way. So once we had the material determined, we came up with this component, which would be like this. So for us, it's kind of like a Baroque wall or something. It had a kind of reversibility about it. You could flip it upside down. It would work the same way. You could put all the heating and cooling in it. We made it kind of shapy so you could put it on the floor. It would stand up on its own. You wouldn't need any scaffolding to hold it up. It would have a kind of finish to it. So it was kind of this idea of one-stop shopping or multitasking element that you can make architecture with. So we built these really large models in our shop. In this case, it's just pink foam that you can cut easily with a like a wire, hot wire. and started building these models, and then realized how strong these things were structurally. You could push on them, and they were incredibly stable. You could make each floor plan a little bit different. They would stand on top of each other, like a house of cards or something, but not flimsy cards, like really thick cards. And the interior would have kind of interior space. The concave surfaces would make these balconies, which were required. And for us, there in Germany, you could come up with a whole new idea about low income, affordable housing that could be built really cheap and really quick. And for us, it had a scale. For us, it had a kind of I don't know, maybe human, or but like a domestic scale for housing. So with one or two components, you could produce a lot of variation, complexity. You could combine these with timber operable windows, again on a kind of timber floor. And then in terms of plan making, you have this kind of undulating perimeter wall, which is the insulation, the structure. And then on the insides, you can do whatever you want. You can have like open work, live, loft, or if you like a bunch of walls, you could put a bunch of walls in here and make it into tiny little, German, sleeping rooms. And each floor could be slightly different from the one above it. So there was this kind of logic of stacking these things around a core that could be done like a prototype. So you could make this one. It could be 4 stories. It could be 6 stories. You could build it in Hamburg. You could build it in, Helsinki. It would still work. It would still make sense. And you could build it just build everything off-site and then haul them with trucks and then assemble them quite quickly, again with a kind of limited number of construction components to produce it. So we went through this whole process of showing it to a developer, and we won some money from Holcim, the sustainability guys in Switzerland. They gave us some money to start mocking up actual one-to-one pieces. I mean, we knew how to, again, like some of these other projects, we knew how to do weird form work based on some of our other projects, so it wasn't so hard. Once you made one form, you could produce, 40 or 50 pours like this. You could have different finishes for them. So in a way, even though it was a competition, we could prove the viability of the project quite quickly by constructing these kinds of elements. In the meantime, in Berlin, we had the housing crisis. If you think about Berlin, in the Cold War, it was a shrinking city. People were leaving it. The government had to give you incentive to go there and study and live there. So in the meantime, there's a housing crisis. In the meantime, in the last 6-7 months now, there's sort of a hyper crisis with the refugee crisis. We have 1 million Syrians and people from the Middle East moving to Germany within the last 12 months. So in a way, with Merkel, really this is, every day is changing, but has been seen as this kind of crazy thing of so many refugees coming to Germany, a place that's slightly smaller than Montana, where I grew up, with 800,000 people. So in a way, in the East, you have housing, a lot of NP housing, but no jobs, and in the West and the South, a lot of jobs, but no housing. So in a way, we could continue working with our infralight project as a point tower to look at density. So in Berlin right now, and this is what we did in the spring with our students, is like, how do you add density in a city like Berlin? So you can build a skyscraper, or you can build on top of existing buildings, or you can build next to them, or you can build buildings, in between the spaces where the buildings were destroyed in World War II. But in this case, for urban living, which was an initiative by the city planning director about generating affordable housing, now housing for students and refugees. So the idea was to look at a prototype using that idea for a kind of point high rise. So this is the Karl Marx alley, this is the Alexanderplatz alley. This was like the kind of, during the communist era, the kind of show street, for this Plattenbau, this Marxist housing. But we found at the same time, it's not a particularly dense residential place, and it wasn't a particularly lively one. It was a fairly homogeneous programmatically, but we discovered there was at least 20 or 30 sites where you could drop in new housing without, disrupting the neighbors in terms of, light or air setbacks through this kinds of type. So these are all the sites that we found with more or less the same kind of building typology that you could add, thousands and thousands of apartments without having a negative effect on the neighbors. Saw that one, and again, some of these are the buildings that these are adjacent to. So in a way, there's kind of familiar in terms of how they will be constructed, in terms of the production of materials, but also kind of familiar in terms of even the kind of architectural language of these buildings along the Karl Marx LA. In this case, the engineering adjusted slightly. We embed steel rods into the concrete to produce a high rise. In this case, the concrete embeds the rods, it fire protects them and stiffens them from buckling to produce 20 or 24-story high rises. Quickly, just to finish on a couple projects, again, using installation as a way of getting to an architectural building project. We produced an installation in Marrakesh for the Biennale in a site-specific, and the idea of the installation was to provide kind of public encounter. Marrakesh has no museum of modern art, so to make it kind of publicly available. So we got a really fantastic site next to the Khattabia mosque in Marrakesh, next to it in this area of this ruin where we had a 5-meter grid. And produced an installation. And one of the things we did we were sort of drawing this thing in Berlin and then going to Marrakesh to build it was, hyperbolic structure, you're using a lot of software to produce it, but at the same time, anticipating ways of building it which were local and kind of handmade. So we looked at a tradition of weavers as a possible way of constructing this exhibition. So we drew the thing digitally, then we made a large-scale model in our shop, which is an idea of ruled geometry, which is simply straight lines that are offset to each other that can produce complex surfaces, but in a really simple way. So in a way, this is the grid that we produced next to the mosque. But I think for us, it's an installation, but for us, it's also a prototype. So we do produce these things, but there's a kind of open-endedness where, maybe this becomes rescaled at a different project where it's the scale of, say, a factory or, in the north, or could rematerialize in steel or concrete. This is Mohammed, who was our foreman for the project. So he was an expert weaver and knew how to construct the piece, how to produce the kind of knots to make it. So this kind of collaboration with the technology, to us, we had no idea how to do this stuff, made the project work. So we used local stripped pine for the scaffolding. In the souks, we would find guys, who would weld these really simple pieces for us. We used donkey power, to get all the project, all the material onto the site, and then could build the whole thing in 2 weeks. So this is the project when it was finished, which you could kind of move around, or you could move through it as a kind of space. And then again, using very kind of ad hoc ways of, these were our foundations, which were just trays of metal with rocks put into them. And again, the spacing of the string or yarn had to do with the amount of time we had to produce essentially a temporary installation. So in a way, that project led directly into this one, which we finished a few months ago for the American Academy. So, shifting from the south to the north, we're interested, like some of these other projects, in a large, roof structure, but at the scale of a, pretty small pavilion. The American Academy is over here on the left is a historical villa from the 19th century along the Wannsee Lake, on a very beautiful garden. And for fellows to study. So in a way, it's a kind of study pavilion where scholars could come in here and have a kind of individual place to be private and study, or they can open these sliding doors and come out to a porch and sit there and hang out and meet other people, and then enclosed by this steel roof. So the translation was from, of course, of scale, but also one of translating to a steel structure. It's next to a Kobe statue here from the 40s, and then situated behind this wall. So in plan, it's really simple, almost diagrammatic, a series of 7 study carrels, toilet and a little kitchen. And then as a kind of, I guess for me, an American idea, a study, a porch around it. It sits a little bit off the ground, so you can open your doors and sit on it and work also in the nice weather, and then built out of a number of limited components, the roof and 4 columns, which are also the drain pipes for the roof that clad this. So extremely precise, laser cut steel construction that could produce this piece, but very much also, I suppose, in the tradition of European pavilions, from Corbusier's Heidi Weber pavilion in Zurich to Barcelona pavilion, things like this. So the structure is extremely light. That extends across the spaces, the sliding rooms, and then we infilled it with furniture from Vitra. But then the idea was this kind of 2 heights, the kind of door height with the sliding doors here, and then the roof has a kind of canopy that encloses the whole space. But then that we had figured out how to do through the earlier project, the Marrakesh project, in terms of how to do a complex hyperbolic roof for the project, which works like that in the daytime. At the nighttime, the walls kind of uplight and light sort of emphasize the roof as a continuous surface, and then the study spaces, you can close the curtains and study in a kind of individual space here. Again, if you want to, you can come out and use the space on the exterior. So I suppose one of the ideas of a project like this has been this idea to work between different scales of projects and different kinds of focus, and in sense of detailing and the kind of tectonics of the projects. Which is in a way, I think, helps keep the project quite lively for us. So it's a slightly different lecture than I did the other night, but I kind of wanted to show you what that means for us in terms of the kind of research aspect, the fabrication aspect of the project, and how that might find itself or situate itself in the kinds of building projects we're doing in the practice also. So thanks again for the invitation, and it's fantastic to be here. Thanks. So we'll open it up for questions. Anybody? Hopefully there should be a lot of questions at this time. Anybody want to start?
Regarding the refugee crisis and building affordable housing, how do you act in, say, the length at which you think the refugees will stay in a city like Berlin? So, do you design the housing to maybe accommodate someone else after possibly they return to Syria or countries that stabilize?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's happening at a lot of different speeds. I mean, what you didn't see is, in the lecture I showed the other night, is, I mean, there's a lot of temporary housing right now. So in places like the Tempelhof, the airport from the 30s is filled with 2,000 refugees. So there's a kind of ad hoc temporary housing. So what I showed would be the next step, which should be more permanent. But it's such a fast-moving situation. It's yet to be seen if the Syrians will actually go to back to Syria. In the 50s and 60s, you had migration from Turkey, so-called guest workers. Those communities stayed and built their own communities in Berlin. So it's yet to be seen if that's a temporary condition or it's going to be a permanent one. And I'm guessing a majority will integrate through work, through into that society. If people leave, again, there's still a steady demand for housing in Berlin, in Germany. So I don't expect occupancy for people migrating in and migrating out. I think there'll be a constant demand. So whether it's refugees, students, or the simple need for affordable housing, I think there'll always be a pressure. So, and so the things we design and build are flexible enough to accommodate those different situations, no matter who that might be.
Thanks for coming. It's really great lecture. Beautiful work. I have a two-part question. In your initial slide, the triangle, practice, teaching, and research, and it seems like something essential to your work is that you created the space for research in your practice. And two things are apparent. One is that you talk about these clients, which tend to be or are often repeat clients, and you mentioned these family-owned companies that place a great emphasis on their image and the quality of their campuses. Can you talk a bit first about those types of clients and the importance that they place on the inventiveness and the research in your work?
Oh,
And
yeah.
the other half is students. You mentioned a number of times, well, we brought students there, we brought students in, and we created these opportunities for research and experimentation. The role of students, not in your teaching, but in your practice.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it really flattened out. When I worked in a practice, as an intern, 100 years ago, it was much more hierarchical. And I think what happens now is students come in and they know things we don't know. So I think the hierarchy's flattened. Like, there was a couple of projects like the project with the Penn students and the GST students. They brought in skills that we didn't have. So in a way, they can work pretty independently or offer something new. So in a way, I think that works out really well. So in terms of setting up these kind of study projects in the practice, I like that idea of apprenticeship, but also the idea of running a studio within the practice. So it's easy to send them down someplace and have them do a survey on, say, new technology, and then they'll come back and report to us. So that's changed quite a bit in terms of what an internship, who that person might be, or what they might do. So that's that in a very optimistic way. It's a way of, rather than us going out and telling the world what we're doing, bringing them in, and they inform a lot of the processes that we're doing. So that's a kind of really exciting change. Then the other aspect of your question, the Mittelstand, which are these family-owned companies, which I guess maybe 80 years ago you would find in this country. So they pass on from generation to generation, and so these are places they're extremely proud of, and not just simply pride of place kind of thing, but also they understand the idea of architecture as a tool for attracting people to work there, to be competitive. So companies like Audi, which definitely isn't family-owned, but they'll come to us and say, what's architecture and what's master planning, and how can that make what we do better, in terms of attracting talent or the work process, or it's quite interesting. So I think you kind of see that across the board with these kinds of companies in Germany. And then I think, as you saw in a couple examples, somehow their technology being part of the architectural process, whether it's chainsaws or laser tools, but there's a kind of, I don't know, it's also this idea of patronage, maybe. When you're actually working with a person or 4 or 5 persons and not a committee or not a shareholder or a stockholder, there's a completely different dialogue. So I think architecture is given a different kind of status in terms of what it can do for them, not simply to, I suppose earlier, not in a kind of Richard Meyer way of having a beautiful prestige architecture, but in a way the workplace, in a way there's a social component about the workplace. And how that plays out in an architectural setting and how the architectural, again, for some factories, they broke down the idea of white collar, blue collar, everybody works together. So how people work has changed. Rem was in Berlin last week and showed the Tesla plant in Arizona, which is a mega structure. And, what does that mean architecturally? Is it just a gigantic big box project, or do people actually work there, or is it just robots? So, and most of these companies we work for, they have robots, but they also have lots of people that work in them, and how that works. So I think that helps give architecture a kind of, it instrumentalizes it in a completely different way.
It kind of seems like a lot of your process, it seems like some of your process goes from like study model to, from study model.
To microphone, to.
Yeah. So it seems like a lot of your process goes from study model to installation to building, and that you're kind of testing concepts from a small idea to a slightly bigger human scale concept to a full scale building. Do you find that most of your buildings in recent years have gone through that linear process, or do you sometimes jump from a study model right to a building concept without going through that?
It's not always linear. Like we did this, and we got that. I mean, we did in Chote, we were doing a large hotel project, and it was really about it being in the, it was like a building at the scale of a master plan almost. It was really about modeling that thing as an idea, and then and now it's going to a building scale. So I think there's a lot of jump cutting across work areas in the sense of you do what you need to do to get the result you want. So it's not always, sometimes it's material to form to space to program. Sometimes it's model. There's different ways of connecting the dots, I think, in terms of process. But it's kind of nice for us because it's so differentiated. I mean, the projects are so different, and the scales and the strategies are so different, so it keeps, I don't know, I mean, it's kind of like you don't ever have to worry about being signature office or something because the projects get set up. But I think, I don't know, maybe it's like going back to the 20s, you're always looking for something new, a tool, something to drive an architectural idea. So we do like it when there is a possibility that there's some kind of text that's generational, that helps generate a project, and sometimes it's context, which sounds old-fashioned, but sometimes it could be a landscape that generates a project. Sometimes it's a technology that might inform and result in how it, so I think, that, I don't know, that somehow that keeps things maybe more honest for us to find what those instruments are in setting up a project and then using that to drive an outcome. I could put the Leonard Skinner back on.
Well, I'm a graduate from Georgia Tech 2 times, and I came specifically to hear you talk. I flew in from Dubai, and I have what you just said, context. So I'm interested in your approach to the research meets academic meets practice. So I'd like to talk to you about potential collaborations for projects.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, no, the little triangle, yeah, it's not always perfectly symmetric. It gets kind of squishy, sometimes. Yeah, it's something that's kind of moving around and changing.
Well, one of the students asked about the low-income housing. One, I have relationships that have funding in Haiti, federal funding, corporate funding, and what I call academic research funding.
Yeah.
So I came back to my alma mater to say, hey, I'm here, have great ideas of how to fund things.
Great, let's talk.
Yeah, I know,
Yeah.
I'm hot.
Yeah.
And I really am interested in that intersection of getting students out of the classroom and giving them exposure, pre-exposure to coming and get a master's degree and a PhD.
Yeah.
To the research
Yeah.
meets the collision of
Yeah.
science and art.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting because I think, you know, I always say this, so if you work with art students, they make art, you know, music students make art, and there's always that gap between the academic studio and you know, I hate to say the real world or something, but I think that's one thing we try to do is to try to,
That's what I love about your practice.
Yeah.
Bridge the gap.
Yeah.
In a way. And
That's-
if more firms do that,
yeah,
you know, they integrate research and development into their practice.
yeah,
That's a demand supply for all industries right now.
yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah,
So I really enjoyed your talk. The work is really beautiful, and I think one of the things. So it's not really a question; it's more of a comment. Is that, and I think it's very useful since the majority of the audience here are students. What I truly appreciated about the way you presented your work is how you talked about the role of process in your way of thinking, and this idea of starting at kind of full-scale study or model study, testing in ideas, and then seeing how it gets applied at kind of full scale of the architect, result itself in architecture. I think a lot of times, you know, what happens in the academic studios, it seems like, you know, sometimes I'm sure there's this question like, why am I really doing this, and where is this going? How is this useful for
Yeah.
me as I start
Yeah.
imagining myself as a practicing architect,
yeah,
or in some other, you know, whatever my trajectory might be. And so that's what I thought was, what I hope was clear to the audience here, is just saying that it does matter, and that the kind of tie of how you start kind of this kind of focus scale and then scaling up to the scale of architecture or the scale of like urban planning, the scale of factory, you know, it's all part of that same
Yeah.
conversation. So
Yeah.
it's just more of a comment.
no,
Can
that's,
everybody hear
yeah.
that question? Can everybody hear back in the back? Okay, because it's important you guys heard that, yeah.
No, I think, I mean, I remember when I was a student, you know, in the middle of nowhere, you know, in Montana, and, you know, we took structural engineering classes, and it was about doing formulas, you know. I mean, it was just something I had to do, and years later in practice, we started working with structural engineers where, you know, that might be that might be an architectural idea. And it was so exciting, you know, we had a Swiss engineer, and, you know, the structural depth, and that could be a space, and that could be program, and all of a sudden these things that used to be obligations became work areas that, you know, could be, you know, an architectural idea, could be an idea about sustainability, could be an idea about structure, could be an idea about a mechanical system. And that kind of inclusiveness was so excited when we taught at the AA, you know, you were constantly kind of going across those boundaries, and it went from being an obligation to being a kind of opportunity or a series of opportunities that was so fabulous. You know, it was like somebody just turned the lights on or something at that point. It was so interesting. But I think, particularly in the context of a school like this, I think you have so many resources and you have so much opportunity to kind of create a vitality that way. So, and you know, and you have space here, and you can work on hands-on, and you can build. I saw things, you know, build at the scale of 1-to-1, and I mean, man, you can you can do a lot.
Yeah, just to pick up on it, one thing that a connection that I saw through several projects that I'm sure you guys picked this up too, but I thought it was just amazing, which was, I've always been interested in the pavilions you did when you were doing the laser cut tubes and the bend, you know, where you cut them and be able to bend them.
Yeah.
And these are just like abstract material exercises where you're using a tooling technique, a material, and you're just discovering things. Then, you know, you iterate that at the scale of the building with the rotating tubes.
Yeah.
That never got built. But then several years later, in the Barcelona tower, where you did the precast pieces, that shows up again.
Yeah.
For me, I mean,
Yeah.
it's not metal and it's not laser cutting,
Yeah.
it's not tubes, but it's the same kind of effect with, you know, custom formed precast to create the same kind of moire effect that you did with the rotating tubes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for students, I mean, that's where a material study that you might think has no relevance anywhere, you know, years later can
Yeah.
resonate in a completely different material in a completely different context. And I thought that was,
Yeah.
I had not seen that tower in Berlin, although I was there over Christmas, I didn't see it, but
Yeah.
it was amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really
Stays.
beautiful.
Yeah.
I have a question which kind of follows up on that. It's a two-part question. Going back to your triangle, you get, you know, academic
practice, research.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you define research, because it kind of actually should be shifted somewhere in between academic and practice.
Research is always the stuff we don't get paid for.
It's just not productive work, right?
Yeah.
The second part
Yeah.
of the question is actually, to Scott's point, how do you capture the result of the research as something which is more than just, your own intuitive experience in the office, and it becomes something that's living and transferable in the office?
Well, it becomes alive. I mean, when you can find an application for it, then it comes alive. But like I said, that you need a certain amount of freedom, I guess, of doing it. That it doesn't. And it does, I mean, our research, it's not like 10 people with white lab coats, that show up at 8 o'clock and do it every day. I mean, it's a really dynamic and fluid. Sometimes it's nobody, sometimes it's 10 people. Sometimes it's sponsored by, things like Serpentine, the house that we're doing now, or sometimes it's aligned with an actual ongoing project. Sometimes it's with a competition. Sometimes it's some guy, some student just throwing pots on a wheel in the basement, just for the hell of it. So it's very somewhat informal in terms of what it is and how it gets done, but there's usually something going through it. But the first part of the presentation, the idea of the atlas or the idea of the archive is kind of where that stuff goes. And I think as Scott was saying, sometimes it gets activated right away, sometimes 5 years later, sometimes never at all. So I think there is this idea of maybe that's the encyclopedic part of producing this stuff and using it. But how it gets done is one question, and then what it is maybe is the next question. And then the third one is, can you use it or not? So, but I don't know, somehow it's an activity that's, it's an exercise that's important for us because the tendency is, you have all these forces on economics, get things done fast, don't be experimental. So it's also, maybe it's a form of resistance to the building culture, the building market, clients, developers, who are not always, encouraging that. So it is a kind of space that we had to set up, but also have to protect in a way. In the practice, but yeah, it's a much more dynamic and unpredictable one than doing projects, building projects.
So would it be fair to say that it's more about a culture of experimentation?
At the end of the day, yeah, I think that's part of the setup, and I would say then a form of resistance, right? A status quo of how most people do projects in Berlin. So that also is part of the identity of what we are, what the practice is.
Frank, thank you so much. It was really for, I think, there's so much intelligence in the work. But there's part of me as an urbanist that gets a little nervous when I see kind of, asking students to start with the material and then, proceed from there to the form of the building without it being clear sort of where response to urban context, response to environmental orientation, where those kinds of things fit in. So could you talk about how your firm, I mean, a lot of your projects look like it's the same on all four sides, and talk about how you deform to context.
Well, urbanism, I mean, context is one issue. I mean, urbanism is another one. I mean, that would be another lecture. And we have in the last 5 or 10 years started working on master plans and urban scale projects. And
I'm talking about the design of how the buildings, not urban design.
Okay.
The scale of these buildings.
yeah,
How do they either differentiate south from north facades, or how do they respond to differences in what's around them when they're located in a more urban?
oh, the projects I showed today, I mean, something like Korea, not at all. I mean, it's almost was without any kind of context other than up, down, north, south. So a project like that exists almost without a context. Other projects, I'm trying to think of the projects I showed today. Maybe the tower, right? I mean, that was an idea of adapting to a master plan. It was also an idea of adapting to views and orientation and, sun, all of these things. So that project, I would say, would be more contextual in the sense.
But just where in that process of sort of from those really compelling, I think, diagrams at the beginning of sort of showing material, starting with material, then the tool, and then the form, where does thinking about that, the context and how it's adapting to that, is that part of the tool, almost another form of the tool?
I think so, yeah. I mean, in the smart materials one, probably it is more bottom up. I mean, from material to tools to a kind of building block, and then siding them, and then through the siding, as you say, they can then start to differentiate southwest, left, right, up, down. So I think in that case, it would start later in the process versus other projects I didn't probably show today, but would start with those conditions of site as a kind of starting place. So I think where a project starts and stops depends on the setup, but it is addressed, but it does become a kind of probably further down the line than some of the Karl Marx, the point towers, for example. That's information that gets put in maybe at a later stage in the process.
You mentioned a little while ago spaces for robots, and the only thing I could come up with are storage facilities where it's climate controlled and there's no natural light. It's just for the robots. Is that a program, or can you see the future of robots, spaces for robots?
Yeah, we're doing a building right now, which is a logistic building, which is giant storage, and it's a huge building and 2 people work in it.
Right.
And then, so we just treat it as a site. So on top of the building, we built a fitness studio. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, it was, yeah. So there's this weird kind of connection between almost no occupancy of a gigantic building, and then using it almost as if it was a site to put another activity that's quite active. But you do find these kinds of weird juxtapositions of no occupation and a kind of hyper-occupation of different points depending on how they're doing. I mean, that thing that Ramp showed last week at Tesla, I mean, it was gigantic, and I think it was almost 80% robot. So what does that mean urbanistically? What does that mean architecturally? You don't need skylights. It's like an architecture of almost warehousing certain activities, but they're not, I guess, about a kind of human activity. So you end up, again, with these kind of sites within a larger site that's about a very different idea of production and activity. Maybe the future, I don't know. We still have the humans running the robots in most of these things, so.
Last question. Anybody have one more question? Nope.
Well, I'm curious about the role. There's one more. Why not? I'm curious about the role of drawing and communicating with the fabricators and the contractors. What role does that play, and how has that changed in your practice over the last 20 years?
We don't, I don't know, we don't like, it's all about how you get something made. So in a way, the shop drawing has superseded the rendering. We're not so much interested in, we have to do them for certain reasons, but we're less interested in drawing as representing or giving an impression of something, and we're more interested in drawing as a instrument to construct something.
That's precisely what I mean. In terms of how something is made, are you going through a shop drawing process?
Yeah.
Are you going
Yeah.
through a file factory, or is it some
Shop drawing, yeah. We make a model, then we make a Rhino model of it. We give it to a fabricator. They draw how they understand it, send it back to us. We sign them, they build it. That's what drawing is for us now. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Welcome. It was weird.